Dawn broke over Lisbon with a quiet confidence that felt eternal. Bells echoing across tiled roofs, while the river breathed in slow silver waves. Merchants prepared their stalls. Priests rehearsed familiar prayers, and families followed rituals repeated for generations. Unaware that history was holding its breath, the city pulsed with wealth drawn from oceans and empires. Its streets thick with promise and certainty. But no one understood what was coming next, because collapse rarely announces itself with thunder. It waits behind ordinary mornings, hiding inside routine. In those first hours, Lisbon appeared invincible, a monument to human ambition, suspended in a fragile balance that had already begun to shift beneath the earth. Lisbon stood as a jewel of the Atlantic world, layered with monasteries, palaces, and warehouses. Swollen with spices and gold, its identity was carved from exploration and faith, a city convinced of divine favor and commercial destiny. Sailors spoke of distant storms, yet the harbor itself seemed protected by providence. Administrators tracked trade with meticulous confidence, believing order could be engineered indefinitely. The air carried incense and salt, blending devotion with enterprise. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. But in those days, certainty ruled every conversation. The foundations beneath the stone were older than memory, storing pressures no ledger or sermon could measure, patiently accumulating energy beneath the illusion of permanence. Daily life followed a choreography of sound and motion that masked the city's vulnerability. Bakers lit ovens before sunrise, their heat drifting into narrow streets where neighbors exchanged news and blessings. Artisans hammered metal and stitched cloth, contributing to an economy that seemed endlessly renewable. Children memorized catechisms, while dockworkers synchronized their labor with the tide. Nothing suggested interruption. Yet the collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, hidden within the earth's slow negotiations. Tiny tremors, too subtle for alarm, threaded through the bedrock like whispers. Most citizens never felt them, and those who did dismissed the sensation as imagination, trusting the familiar rhythm of Lisbon more than the language of stone. Invisible warnings multiplied in forms no one recognized as connected. Dogs barked without clear cause. Water in wells quivered, and a faint unease lingered in the air like static before a storm. Scholars debated natural philosophy, but the tools to read tectonic tension did not yet exist. Religious leaders framed anomalies as tests or curiosities, quickly absorbed into daily devotion. Commerce continued with unwavering momentum. Ships arrived, cargo was tallied, and contracts were sealed with confidence. Beneath it all, pressure accumulated with mathematical indifference. The city's grandeur, its dense masonry and vertical ambition, increased the stakes of any disturbance. Still, Lisbon slept each night believing stability was its birthright, unaware that the ground itself was rehearsing a rupture. Tension rose not through spectacle, but through accumulation. Markets grew louder, streets more crowded, and construction pushed skyward, each addition layering weight onto ancient soil. The monarchy's administrative reach expanded, reinforcing the belief that human systems could master uncertainty. Yet nature was conducting a parallel calculation, measuring stress along unseen faults. But no one understood what was coming next, because the signals did not resemble danger in any familiar language. They blended seamlessly into the city's noise. Confidence became its own blindfold. The more Lisbon prospered, the less imaginable catastrophe seemed, creating a psychological architecture as rigid as its stone forcades, resistant to the idea that stability could fracture without warning. Critical decisions, made years earlier, unknowingly shaped the city's exposure. Dense urban planning maximized commerce and prestige, but narrowed escape and concentrated mass. Heavy religious and civic buildings anchored neighborhoods with symbolic power, yet amplified structural vulnerability. Resource allocation favored expansion over resilience, reflecting a worldview that prioritized growth. These were rational choices within their context, reinforcing Lisbon's status as a global hub. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly, encoded in these cumulative decisions. Each stone laid with pride also increased the stakes of disturbance. By the time anyone questioned the balance between ambition and safety, the forces beneath the city had already surpassed human timelines and intentions. The morning of rupture arrived, disguised as a routine. Worshippers gathered for holy observances, candles flickering in sanctuaries thick with incense. Conversations drifted between commerce and faith, grounded in expectation of another ordinary day. Then the earth moved with a force that rewrote orientation itself. Sound collapsed into a roar that erased language, and stone answered with violent motion. Buildings swayed, cracked, and surrendered to gravity in seconds that stretched into disbelief. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late. Streets transformed into shifting corridors of dust and falling masonry, while the city's carefully ordered geometry dissolved into unpredictable motion, exposing how thin the boundary was between permanence and sudden instability. As structures failed, human reactions formed a mosaic of instinct and confusion. Some fled toward open spaces, others froze inside collapsing interiors, and many sought spiritual refuge amid the tremors. The air thickened with debris, muting cries and distorting distance. Familiar landmarks vanished behind clouds of pulverized stone, erasing orientation. But no one understood what was coming next, because the first shock was only part of a cascading sequence. The river withdrew in an unnatural silence, revealing the harbor floor like a wound in the landscape. Curiosity and desperation drew crowds toward the exposed shoreline, unaware that the environment itself was reconfiguring in preparation for another devastating movement. When the water returned, it did so with indifferent momentum, surging inland and rewriting the coastline in moments. Boats collided with buildings, and streets became channels for uncontrollable force. Fire soon followed, ignited by shattered lamps and ruptured kitchens, spreading through debris with relentless appetite. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, but now chaos defined every horizon. Heat, smoke, and instability layered into a new environment where survival depended on improvisation. Social hierarchies blurred under shared threat, and the city's infrastructure, once a symbol of mastery, became an obstacle course of hazards, forcing inhabitants to navigate a landscape no longer governed by familiar rules. In the aftermath, Lisbon resembled an unfinished sketch, erased midline. Entire districts were flattened, and the geometry of streets existed only in memory. Survivors gathered in improvised encampments, negotiating fear, grief, and uncertainty without the structures that once organized daily life. Authorities struggled to reassert coordination amid scarcity and shock. Yet within this disruption, patterns of cooperation emerged alongside tension, revealing how fragile and adaptable social systems could be. By the time the signs became clear, it was already too late to preserve the old city, but not too late to redefine its future. The catastrophe forced a confrontation with nature's scale, challenging assumptions about control and permanence. Long-term consequences extended far beyond reconstruction. Philosophers, theologians, and administrators across Europe wrestled with the implications of a city undone in minutes. Questions about divine order, natural law, and human responsibility intensified, influencing intellectual and political currents. Lisbon's rebuilding became an experiment in urban planning and disaster response, embedding lessons about structure, spacing, and governance. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, yet its echoes reshaped conversations about risk and resilience for generations. The event transformed from local tragedy into a reference point, a reminder that prosperity and vulnerability are often constructed side by side within the same ambitious framework. In reflection, Lisbon, before the earthquake, appears suspended between triumph and fragility, a city confident in its continuity until the ground revised that narrative without negotiation. The morning routines, the layered stone, and the collective certainty now read as a study in but no one understood what was coming next, because collapse rarely conforms to expectation or timetable. It accumulates silently, then reveals itself with irreversible clarity. Lisbon's story endures as a meditation on human ambition confronting natural forces, a reminder that stability is always provisional. The city rebuilt, but the memory of that rupture remains, whispering that every monument stands atop a dynamic earth.